Hi everyone. I just wanted to a quick introduction to this week's module, which is on metaphysics. And there's a lot going on in this module, so I'm going to make this brief, and you can kind of delve into everything we have. We've got one of the African philosophy conversations, which I've been doing, which I've done with Dr. Suleiman Bashir Dianya, who's a really major, important African philosopher who works at Columbia University in New York. So that's great, and I think it's a really great conversation with him. There are also a couple of History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps episodes that I want you to listen to, and there's also reading from our text for this week as well, basically the chapter or the section on metaphysics. And so in a certain sense, all I really want to do is kind of give you a quick introduction or overview to the areas that I decided to focus on. And there's a lot more we could do in metaphysics. If you've taken a metaphysics course, you know that there's a lot to it. There's a lot to discuss in it. So I've chosen 5 kind of areas, I suppose, that I want to talk about. And most of them have corresponding readings in our text, but the first one does not, and it's the notion of time. We do talk about this in the Dianya conversation, though, and so you do have some kind of frame of reference. And so I've also got a lot of, some material in the module for you to look at as well. And I start with, the place that almost everyone starts in a course like this when they're talking about time, and that's with John Mbidi and his book African Philosophy and Religion, in which he offers a theory of time, and it's connected to a couple of words that are really Bantu language words, and the thing you have to know about Bantu languages is that they often combine with Arabic, and Dianya mentions this, and the 2 words are sasa and zamani. And so what he does, and you can see this in a chart that I've duplicated in our module, he defines those in terms of the kind of view of time that each of those words represents. So zamani has to do with the past up to basically the immediate past, whereas sasa overlaps with zamani, and it kind of covers the present and into the future as well. So the reason that Mbidi offers this theory of time in a certain sense is that there's this perception by people outside of Africa that there's an African sense of time. And what they usually mean by that is that Africans are late for everything, and they walk to their own sense of time. They don't keep schedules and all of that. It's usually a pretty racist sort of notion about time, right? It's really a kind of coded way of talking about people being at best traditional, at worst primitive, or not civilized or something like that. And so that's been around for a long time in European discourse about Africans. And so the question arises, is there an African sense of time or not? And Mbidi is trying to make a case that yes, there is in a certain sense, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And so he kind of unpacks this notion. There's been a lot of discussion around his characterization of time. I talk about a little bit of that in this module, and I also give you some other ways that people have tried to account for some version of time in Africa. I also try and think about, what exactly a depiction like this is actually accomplishing. Is this what philosophers would think of as a metaphysics of time, in the way that we might recognize from, some of the Western thinkers, or is it doing something else entirely? And so it's worth thinking about how we think about time. And so I try and unpack some of that, and I hope that that spurs some thoughts on the nature of time for you as well. So that's the first thing we talk about. The second thing we talk about is the nature of the self, or the nature of the person. And there are readings in our text about this. Shegan Badagesen's paper, Enion, the Yoruba Concept of a Person, is actually a really great article that kind of unpacks a set of words that are used for person within Yoruba thought. And within Yoruba culture, really, not even kind of anything as formalized as thought. You could probably see correlates to this within, within English or within Spanish or other languages as well. But what Badageson is arguing, in a certain sense, is that there is an approach, there is an African approach to thinking about what a person is, and it doesn't map easily onto Western approaches. But that gets covered over, that gets obscured when you use only Western languages to talk about your metaphysical ideas. And so there are a lot of people that have talked about notions of self and person. We can't even begin to touch the range of people. Ifeanyi Mekiti is one of the major figures, and more recent ones are some people we'll be hearing from in future conversations in this course, including Bernard Matalino, who's done quite a lot on this as well. So we'll kind of unpack some of those notions of what it means to be a person within African thought. But this is to get you started. There are a couple of videos in that section as well. Jennifer Lisa Vest talks about Kwame Gyetche's notion of persons, the Akan notion of persons, and then there is a short video by Kwame Anthony Appiah, who is a philosopher in New York but of Ghanaian descent, Ghanaian British descent, and he talks about philosophies of identity. And so if you think about it, identity is going to be connected to the notion of persons. Who are we, essentially? And so that is all kind of packed up in this overall notion of metaphysics as well. So that's general area number 2. And area number 3, what I'm calling what exists. What I mean by that is, do gods exist? Do spirits exist? Do ancestors exist? And if so, how does causation work in that context? I mean, for many people, they might want to say that there is a certain kind of causal power that spirits have. They affect things in the human world or in the physical world within Africa. Well, what sense do we make out of that? When I was teaching at the University of Nairobi in Kenya, I remember once having a kind of it wasn't even a party, it was really just kind of a Friday afternoon gathering of all the philosophers in the department. And we got onto the topic of witches and, spirits and things like that. And now remember, these are all well-trained philosophers. They're, most of them have PhDs. There's some grad students there as well. And, and it was really interesting to see how it split down the middle of the room almost, with some people saying, there's no philosophical reason to believe that there are, spirits, but let me tell you what I've seen. And then they would tell a story about things that happened within traditional villages. And so there was this very powerful sort of notion that there was something going on that was not reducible to philosophical thought. Sorry, I have a cat that's about to come and visit us. You probably heard him. His name is Desmond. He thinks that he's the star of all the shows. Those notions of non-material entities and causation, I mean, we might be inclined to simply say, in the way that you might say in the West, well, I don't believe any of that, empiricism is all there is. And that may well be true, but the question then becomes, how do we think about a world in which those beings are held to exist by a large number of people, whether you happen to believe that they exist or not? There are plenty of examples of people doing interesting philosophical work, presuming that some of those things exist, including the very notion of the person within Western thought that gets developed by Augustine, and there are precedents to it, in the Greek theater. The notion of the person was the mask you would hold up and project to the audience, so you take on a persona. But Augustine is trying to solve the problem of the three in one, the divine notion of Trinity, right? So how could there be three somethings and yet still one God? Well, you could just kind of begin by rejecting the notion of any kind of God, and just say, well, problem goes away. But for Augustine, the struggle to explain that meant that he had to come up with a notion of a single substance, which was in Greek ousia, and three somethings, which were in Greek hypostases. And these hypostases become, in ultimately in English, persons, right? The three persons of the Trinity. Well, what's a person? Well, it's not a substance, it's a relational entity. Three things that relate to each other and relate to everything else. That's how they define themselves, almost like virtual particles or something like that. And so now we get this idea of the person that comes down through history and has all sorts of independent existence of its own, quite apart from theology, quite apart from any belief in Trinitarian gods or theology or anything like that. And so we get this philosophical thought that has this heritage and these concepts which have a kind of coherence to them, but we don't need to hold the metaphysics if we don't want to. Some people do, some people don't. And so that's what I'm interested in all of this. Like, what kind of philosophical work gets done in the space, in the situation where one believes that there are such things as ancestors, where one believes there are such things as witches, as spirits, and so forth. Is our first question simply the question of, does X exist? And once we answer that question, then we go on to everything else. It might be a more interesting discussion to hold that question at bay and ask what comes of the discussion if we suppose that something exists, and that does not invalidate the question of does it in fact exist. So that's the third kind of general area that I wanted to talk about. Area number 4 is what I'm calling metaphysics and language. And one thing you find in African philosophy quite a lot is a close or a strong connection between language and metaphysics. Certainly within the kind of beginnings of academic African philosophy in the mid 20th century with Plessis Temples, in the book Bantu Philosophy, that was very much based on the idea that you can make sense out of an ontology by understanding a language. Okay, if you look closely enough at a language, you will see the ways that people think about their world. All right, and so this is related to what in linguistics is sometimes called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which I talk about a little bit in the module. That's basically the hypothesis that there is a relationship between the way we understand reality and the language we use about it. If you use a certain language, then you are going to have a certain version of reality. Now, that can be quite restrictive, obviously, right? Or it can be simply a kind of influence sort of thing. And this hypothesis has had a lot of discussion around it, but a lot of the connections between metaphysics and language within African philosophy have in one way or another presumed that in order to know a worldview, you have to understand a language, and that means a local language. That means an African language, not the way that English is used or the way that French is used or something like that. Other people we're going to look at, like Kwasi Wiredu, who is a philosopher from Ghana, who taught at the University of South Florida for a long time. He just passed away a few weeks ago. He makes the same case, and we're going to look a little bit more at him next week, or next module, because he makes the case that understanding, the notion of truth depends on understanding, kind of subtleties of the Akan language. So that's part of the discussion around metaphysics within African philosophy as well, and perhaps it's the kind of thing that doesn't come up quite as much in a Western metaphysics course, but I think it's quite crucial within an African metaphysics course. So that's number 4. Number 5 area that I want to talk about, and I'm not going to say much about it here, but Suleiman Bashir Dianya and I talk about this in the discussion, is the notion of the vital force. And this has connections to many of the other things we talked about in this module. It connects up to, what exists and how it exists. Are there spirits? Are they connected together? Is there a kind of grand connection between everything? How does time work? So there's often been posited that there's within African metaphysics a vital force that is a force that flows through and connects everything together. And so people have talked about notions of rhythm, for example, as being central. Dianya talks about art and understanding art properly as accessing that notion of connections. So this really stands against an individualist notion of in other words, presuming that we start as individuals, biological individuals first, and conceptual mental individuals, and then build out from there. If there's a vital force, the first thing we have to understand is how we're connected, not how we are individual. And so that's the number 5, the 5th kind of area of metaphysics that I want us to think about this week. And so you can see there's a lot going on, and this does not exhaust all of the things that we could talk about in connection with metaphysics. But I think it gets us going, and I look forward to what you have to say in the discussion area about this, because I think this is a really, really interesting set of ideas that come up. I will also be interested to see what you may want to say about how this looks like or doesn't look like things that you've studied before in other philosophy courses or in religion courses or in other kinds of courses. Have fun with this. This is really pretty cool stuff. So I will talk to you soon.